Good afternoon. Welcome. So wonderful to have you all here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Alina Dorian, the Associate Dean for Public Health Practice, as well as Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. And I've also been a proud school principal for 10 years. I'm so excited to be relaunching our webinar series titled Principal Practices for Safe Schools. We have an incredible two-part series planned for you, taking place today and the same time next week, Thursday, February 17th, from 4 to 5 p.m. So I'm really looking forward to spending this time together 2 weeks in a row. Today, we're going to focus on thinking through and operationalizing group-based contact tracing and testing in our K-12 settings. We're lucky to have with us our insightful public health expert, as well as incredible colleagues working day and night to keep our schools open and safe. We're fortunate to have them sharing with us today their thoughts, their insights, their wisdoms, and the things that keep them up at night. We hope the information and dialogue today can better inform, empower, and create confidence in the decisions we all need to make to keep our schools vibrant and safe. I'm going to try and keep a bit of time at the end to address your questions. So please use that Q&A button to enter your questions. And thank you for all of those who submitted questions ahead of time. Also use the Q&A to jot down some ideas for further programming that you feel you need and that we can help facilitate as we continue to chart through this academic year. We also welcome comments from all of you who have been putting all of this guidance, especially around group tracing strategies, into action. And we'd appreciate hearing how you're adapting them and uniquely implementing them based on your local circumstances, resources, constraints, and emotional fatigue. So please allow me one more moment to thank our collaborating partners for today, the UCLA School of Education and Information Studies, the California Safe Schools for All team, and our California Connected Consortium, consisting of the California Department of Public Health and our academic partner, UC San Francisco. I also want to recognize and celebrate Black history. Although it's highlighted in the month of February, we need to continue to honor and celebrate it 365 days of the year. Help me welcome our incredible panelists. We're honored to have with us Dr. Sohil Sud. Dr. Sud leads the Safe Schools for All team at the California Department of Public Health, where he works closely with state and local health and education agencies to develop and implement policies to keep our kids safely in school during the COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to this position, Dr. Sud served as Chief Clinical Lead of the Information and Guidance Branch within San Francisco Department of Public Health's COVID Command Center. He is an Associate Clinical Professor of Pediatrics in the Division of Pediatric Hospital Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and he cares for newborns and hospitalized children at a number of Bay Area hospitals. We're also super pleased to have with us Anna-Liza Pacaoan. Shortly into the 2020-2021 school year, Anna-Liza accepted the district lead nurse position in Lucia Unified School District, serving the Central Coast of California. She's also the current Central Coast Section President of the California School Nurses Organization. She earned her BSN with distinction from the University of Saskatchewan, Canada, and received her school nurse credentials at the California State University, Fresno. Anna-Liza is a member of the Santa Barbara County Medical Reserve Corps and the California State COVID-19 response team. She volunteered and worked for the County Public Health Department as a public health nurse, case investigator, contact tracer. She's been very active and passionate about her role as a school nurse, and we're super thankful for that. And she finds tremendous joy and purpose in serving the children and families of her community. We're also very happy to have with us an amazing administrator and veteran panelist of this beloved Principal Practices series, Mr. Matt McClenahan. Matt is the principal at Oak Park High School in Ventura County. He's a graduate of NYU and UCLA School of Education and Information Studies Principal Leadership Institute. Formerly, he was a founding teacher, then principal at High Tech Los Angeles in Van Nuys, California. Prior to that, Mr. McClenahan taught math and social science for nearly 20 years in New York City and Los Angeles. He hopes everyone stays safe and maintains hopefulness in the face of this historic challenge. And lastly, we are so happy to have with us Hannah Mestel. Hannah is the Pandemic Services Coordinator for Pleasanton Unified School District. Prior to joining Pleasanton Unified, Hannah spent nearly 17 years at Google working in product management, HR, strategy, and communications. She holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and a BA in communications and human-computer interaction from Stanford University. She has 2 children, a high school freshman and a 5th grader, a husband who loves word games, and 2 fluffy Labradoodles, Hazel and Leo. And when not at work, you can find her performing on stage in community musical theater productions around the Bay Area. So, once again, thank you to this amazing and talented panel. Thank you to all of you for being here today. And now it is my honor to turn it over to Dr. Sohil Sud.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dorian. It's really a pleasure to be here. Give me just 1 minute to share my screen. So if I can have screen sharing privileges. Let's see. All right, here we go. Apologies about that. I hope everyone's doing all right. And I really want to start by just thanking all of you for your heroic efforts, truly heroic efforts that each of you have done to prioritize and provide safe in-person instruction to California's children. I'm saying that a bit as a policymaker, but more so as a dad who takes his kids to school every morning and feels comfortable doing so because of your efforts that each of you have played. This is particularly true for my 1st grader who spent all of last year in virtual kindergarten. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. The toll of this experience on our children and their health is absolutely real. And I'm referring both to direct consequences of COVID-19, but also the mental health and the anguish of the broader experience. As Dr. Dorian mentioned, I'm a practicing pediatrician. I take care of kids in the hospital. And in the past few years, I've seen every manifestation of this pandemic that you might imagine, from bad COVID-19 illness in children to kids who did just fine, to the teens with overdoses, and the tweens with physical manifestations of stress that were so bad it landed them in hospitals with IVs and CT scans and the whole works. And I imagine right now there's a lot of folks on this call with varying opinions about the path forward. And I think that's a wonderful and important thing. And fundamentally, I think it's born out of love for your child and your community and your student. And I hope what we can all agree on is that we want our kids in school and our teachers in school and our staff in person, and we want them there safely. So let's look at how we're doing and in getting our world back in order. This is a chart from the New York Times that I pulled today, actually. And what you can clearly see is we are on the downslope of the Omicron surge. The cases are in red here, and you can see them sloping down quickly, really as quickly as they went up. So we had a rapid upswing in cases with a rapid transmission of COVID-19, and we are so quite fortunately now on the downswing as far as cases go. What we've seen throughout this pandemic is basically a lagging series of indicators that fall behind cases. So at the bottom here, you'll see hospitalizations, and they are still on the higher part, but now starting to have a downswing. And this is overall hospitalizations in California for those with COVID-19. And deaths are still climbing. And so we will see, it is yet unknown really what the toll of this latest surge will have been throughout California in terms of the number of lives lost to this disease. The other piece that lags even further beyond that is reports and cases and complications of COVID-19 in children. And I'm specifically referring to multi-inflammatory syndrome, MIS-C. So that data as it relates to Omicron is yet to be seen, but we're tracking that information very closely as we go forward. And with regard to schools, this is data from a website called Burbio that tracks basically disruptions to in-person learning throughout the country. And this is data that shows disruption, so basically temporary school closures for one reason or another related to COVID-19 over the past basically 6 weeks. And you can see from this data that California has done relatively well. We educate roughly about 12% of the nation's school children, and the amount of closures that we've had, both throughout the entire school year and specifically within the last few weeks, have been far less than the proportion we care for. And again, that is no easy feat, and clearly it's not perfect, but it is the result of the efforts of all of you on this call, for which we're so eternally really grateful for. So where do we go from here? What did we learn and what are the next steps? And that's what we're here to really focus on. And as time marches on, I'd like to think we're getting smarter and more precise with our response and steadily marching to a place where we focus on prevention, specifically thinking much more about vaccination and indoor air quality. Really to ensure that our bodies and the spaces we occupy can recognize, contain, and remove the threat of COVID-19 before we even really have to be conscious about it. And just to touch on masking a little bit, because I know it's in the news and really at the forefront of everyone's minds. For now, masking remains a part of the strategy. I know the governor's announcement a few days ago has been met with some concern what happens to schools. And so I just want to start off by telling you on February 16th, nothing changes in schools. Schools have had a universal masking mandate, an indoor universal masking mandate in place since the beginning of the school year, and that remains the case. What is going to be shared soon, though, is a sense of where we're headed. Nobody endorses a long-term vision of universal masking in perpetuity. And so we look forward to sharing updated thoughts about what the remainder of the school year looks like shortly. Okay. But today, we're really here to talk about changes that we've already put in place and how we can best support each other in the implementation of that. So really with a focus on managing children exposed to COVID-19 in a K-12 setting and a specific focus on that concept of quarantine. And before going too deep down that path, just a quick disclaimer that everything I present is really from the perspective of the California Department of Public Health. But the way public health works throughout this nation is that stricter guidance may be issued by local public health officials and or other authorities. And also employees are subject to a different set of rules put forth by Cal OSHA. And so there's some nuance to everything I'm saying that must be interpreted both at a state level, but also with additional focuses on what's happening in your local counties and local health jurisdictions. So to dive a little bit deeper into isolation and quarantine, let's make sure we get the terms right, because there's a lot of confusion that I see in the media around it. But when we talk about isolation, we're talking about those who are infected with COVID-19 and separating those from the general population. Quarantine is the same concept of separating someone from an area, but it deals much more with those exposed rather than those who are actually infected. So it's to protect the population in case they become infected, not that they are infected. And the general approach we've always used in California, and actually this is aligned quite a lot with the federal approach, is to isolate someone who's infected. So if you have COVID-19 in the classroom, the recommendation is that you isolate at home. But for those around, the approach has been to identify those who are within 6 feet. And so if you're beyond 6 feet, no specific recommendations to quarantine are there. And those within 6 feet fall within a series of recommended actions depending on the nature of the student who's exposed and the nature of the interaction. So in some situations, it's recommended that they quarantine. In other situations, it's recommended that they don't if the student is fully vaccinated. And if there's been an interaction where both were wearing masks, the recommendation is that the child may stay in school for in-person instruction, but quarantine from extracurricular activities that are higher risk, such as sports. That's been the existing approach. And as of the beginning of this school semester, so in early January, a second approach has been offered. And this is what we call the group tracing approach. And what this approach basically highlights is the idea of still isolating the infected person. So anybody with COVID-19, it's recommended that they stay at home. But for everybody else, keep them in school. For everybody else, keep them in school and notify them of the exposure. So basically send a note to their family and say, your child's been exposed, they can stay in school, they should continue to wear their mask, and they should watch for symptoms, and they should get tested. And so those are the main points of the message that we feel like is appropriate to send out, also underscoring just the general importance for vaccination. So why are we offering this approach? And this is where I want to go a little bit into the science, and then we can hand it over to our esteemed panelists. So there's research behind this general approach, and to highlight some of the studies, we have data now from Illinois, from Massachusetts, from California that shows that when mitigation is followed in school, transmission from someone with COVID-19 to another individual in school is exceedingly low. In one of the studies, it was on the order of 1.5%, and on another study, it was on the order of 3%. So basically, if 100 people in school following school mitigation protocols, 97% of those close contacts are going to end up being negative. And of those that actually do transmit, so if there's another person in that space who does end up with COVID-19, the chances that they're going to spread it to another person and lead to what we might be concerned about an outbreak is even lower. Data from California and from Illinois in a few research studies basically showed in those particular studies, 0 tertiary transmission. So not moving to the third person in that chain from an in-school exposure. I just highlight that that's different from homes and households and other places where you might get COVID-19, but the school setting seems to be a really safe place to be. And I'll note all of this data really came from the Delta time period. As mentioned, we're still learning more about Omicron, but it's reasonable to assume that while there may be slightly more cases in schools as a result of it, that the general patterns will hold true, that schools will remain a safer place and have remained a safer place than other parts of the community, really because of the mitigation that's been going on in there. so that's one piece. The other piece we have is that as folks have transitioned to this idea of keeping kids who are exposed to COVID-19 in schools, we haven't seen a prolongation of cases in the youth. You can see by both of these charts here, those that are under the age of 18, even within subsets of that age bracket, all of those cases are trending down in a reassuring direction. Even though, you know, by our accounts, a large portion of schools and districts have moved to this general concept. And then, frankly, the third reason to move there is that the status quo is you know, dare I say, near impossible to do with high fidelity. The idea of figuring out who was within 6 feet for 15 minutes, identifying them and making these individualized decisions was really challenging during the Delta surge, which in this graph is right here, compared to just the volume of cases that you know, schools would have to track down to identify each individual exposed to someone with COVID-19 now. And so place upon place has followed really in California's lead to suggest that that concept of contact tracing down to the level of the individual has marginal benefit, particularly if you can't do it fast. And if you can't do it fast, essentially you can't do it well. And so for all of these reasons, there's both a scientific and operational rationale to move toward this idea of group-based contact tracing. As mentioned, you know, many national organizations have promoted a similar mantra as we move forward. So this is the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists who released a statement that said, you know, we should really transition away from universal case investigation and contact tracing for individual cases of COVID-19. And as a summary, this was the model before, like we talked about, identifying individuals within 6 feet. And this is the model that is now being recommended by CDPH as an alternative to basically stop at the level of the group, to provide recommendations to that entire group to stay in school and get tested. But I will highlight that means a lot more testing, because we're talking about a lot more people within that catchment area. And that is challenging. The prior model had a really excessive amount of contact tracing, and this model undoubtedly has a higher operational burden when it comes to testing. And that's the next area where we are actively iterating. So can we narrow the amount of people that we recommend testing for, even after exposure? And you know, what's the science behind that? And those are the active conversations we're having right now. To support this general concept, we're trying to do everything we can to support schools as they're working through implementation. And so we have this is our main website, schools.covid19.ca.gov. And on this website, you'll see information that relates to the guidance itself, so more specifics than what I've just mentioned, that comparison chart, sample letters you can send to families in your schools, available in, I believe, 14 languages, and various decision support tools. So you can click through and see the different approaches that are there, both in a PDF version and an interactive version that can work both on the internet, on a computer, but also on your phone. And then we're also working to see what we can do to help support everyone learning from each other. And this is a newsletter basically that we have on our website called Share, which is the School Health Repository of Experiences, where local public health, local education, down to the level of school districts can share what they're doing, and you know, trying to figure out how we can all navigate through these challenging times and all learn from each other. And with that in mind, I want to turn it back over to the stars of the show, who are, you know, our panelists who are really working through all the details of the guidance. I'll close by saying, you know, if you're representing a school, we would love to hear from you. And if you have questions, anything we can do to support, on our main website, we have a technical assistance portal where representatives from the state and actually, you know, many of our colleagues here today from the Virtual Training Academy help field questions and provide support to navigating these challenging times and the nuances related to the guidance. So thank you all very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Sud, for all of your expertise, patience through this process, and everything that you've been doing to help really support us in the school world moving forward. I am now pleased to invite Ms. Anna-Liza Pacaoan to our virtual podium. Anna-Liza?
Hi there. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Dorian. I'm super excited to be here representing school nurses, and especially my school district, Lucia Unified School District. You'll see a beautiful picture here of Pismo Beach and the pier. We're located on the Central Coast. So next slide, please. So our district is located on the Central Coast in South San Luis Obispo County, serving Nipomo to Shell Beach. Our district is about 10,000 students. We've got 19 schools, including one independent study school. We have 10 school nurses with 7 LVNs and 2 health clerks supporting our health offices. And during COVID management, we've really relied on support from our site secretaries, principals, and we have a handful of COVID support people who help make calls and do the contact tracing. And we're all led by myself, the district nurse, and our director of student services. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share our district data, which really supports group tracing and what Dr. said had shared previously. So looking at the first 4 months of this school year, from August to December, amidst the Delta variant, we had 293 positive student cases in class. Of those students, it generated, once we eliminated the vaccinated students and those with a history of COVID, we ended up testing 1,300 students. Of those 1,300 tests, 7 resulted as positive, which gave us a positivity rate of 0.5%, which then led me to believe that schools were a safe place, and the modified quarantine, it was so labor intensive that it didn't really seem to be that effective. So moving forward into 2022, amidst Omicron, compared to the first 4 months of school, these last 4 weeks of school, we've had 1,387 cases. The projected modified quarantine testing would have been 6,000, over 6,000. And these numbers show to be 5 times more the rate of which we experienced in the last months of 2021. Next slide, please. What I will say too about modified quarantine, our modified quarantine testing was done by our team of school nurses along with the CDPH School Binact program. So we were very grateful to have that program be a part of how we were able to do the modified quarantine testing. So as we started this next part of the school year, we started school in January, the 10th of January. And after the first day of back to school, and we had such increase in cases, we had distributed the at-home tests for people to take before coming back to school. We had so many cases. The nurses were so overwhelmed and were communicating that there was just absolutely no way we were going to be able to perform the modified quarantine testing as we were previously. So after the first day of school, I notified our superintendent and our public health department that we no longer had the capacity to sustain individual contact tracing. Now, fortunately, the day after that, on the 12th, CDPH came out with the group tracing guidance. And so that was, I remember the sense of relief I felt that day. So I was very grateful. And I started working with our leadership team, our cabinet, and so we got going and we consulted with our local health department and our legal teams, and the following week, that Tuesday on the 18th, we implemented the group tracing approach. Next slide, please. So the principles of group tracing were relatively simple, and we wanted to keep it simple. So basically, the transition was pretty smooth because it was the extent at which we were able to function the week prior. We were notifying the classroom or the groups of the exposure. We expressed that schools were still a safe place for kids to be. Please monitor for symptoms, test 3 to 5 days after exposure. And we placed the responsibility and involved the parents in doing the testing. So we made sure to provide all these testing options, including what was available in the community. And then we provided the at-home tests also. So that distribution continued following. And then of course, we also implemented, we emphasized the masking and vaccination. Next slide, please. So of course, we have our high-risk groups that we considered also and approached them with a different method other than group tracing. A little different. So with athletes, we decided that their response testing needed to be observed, but could take place during their surveillance testing because they undergo weekly surveillance testing, or could do so individually with their coach or trainer. So the athletes must still continue to wear a well-fitting mask for 10 days. And if it was the case in which the athlete could not wear their mask for 10 days, either due to heavy exertion or water sports, then we implemented that the athlete could test twice during the 10-day period during the after exposure. And this was something that our local health department had allowed. So we implemented that. For our special education students, what we did is the guidance didn't differentiate between masked or unmasked exposures, but best practice, we communicated best practice to the parents and suggested that if they're unable to test, that it would probably be best for them to quarantine at home. However, in some situations, we recognized that that was not always the best option for some of the students, in which case we just continued to monitor the students and they were allowed to stay in school as long as we were monitoring them for symptoms. And then lastly, our favorite are the household contacts. So group tracing just simply does not apply to household contacts. We use the regular quarantine guidance and we implement the stacking method or the Sacramento method for the 10-day PCR and may come back after 14 days. Next slide, please. So the best strategy for success with group tracing we found was to focus on increasing our testing options. So we really worked to educate the community, our school community, on what options were available for testing, including our community test sites and the clinics in the area. We contracted with Aptitude, which is saliva PCR testing. We provide on-site testing for athletes. We continued the distribution of at-home tests, and we're currently working on a contract with Heal 360, which provides simultaneous rapid antigen and PCR tests. Next slide, please. So also, it's very important to still continue the strong mitigation measures that are in place right now, including staying home when you're sick, optimal ventilation, disinfection and sanitizing, promoting vaccine. We hold vaccine clinics on site and increasing PPE as needed. Next slide, please. So the greatest benefit I've found to group tracing is that it has transitioned to a shared responsibility and involvement. The nurses are happier, the parents are happier, where they're supporting individuals to take ownership of their own healthcare, which as a nurse is ideal. And so I felt that that has relieved some pressure off of the schools and off of the nursing team especially. And so that has been a great benefit. But that has also proven to be a great challenge because compliance is also an issue, making sure that individuals are testing. But again, we stress to monitor. Continue to monitor is a sentence that nurses love to use. So we just continue to monitor the situation, especially in the exposed classrooms. But we've really found that it has worked. We have not seen the outbreaks that might be expected. Next slide, please. And lastly, communication is a big factor in the success. Our district maintains a district dashboard for which you can see the number of cases, students, and staff in our district. So you could see the numbers increase with the surge, and then we're now on the decrease. So that's a really important tool for our parents. We also keep open communication and continue empowered education for our parents. We provide district flow charts that can help explain how complicated some situations might be. We continue messaging from district and our health services team, and we have great access to our nursing team. Parents call all the time with questions. We're happy to talk to them and make this a shared effort. That's all for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna-Liza. Wow, incredible work, incredible information. I started off saying I really want to be on that beach. And then you hit me with those January numbers, which reminded me how all of us school administrators feel that we never want to repeat a COVID January again. So thank you again. It's now my pleasure to invite Mr. Matt McClenahan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm the principal at Oak Park High School, which is just into Ventura County. And what I'd like to say before I say anything else is I hadn't seen Ms. Pacaoan's presentation, but I'd just like to say yes to everything that she just put down. We have a very similar approach, and I'd like to just sort of walk you through where we are. So we were very excited to be back on campus in the fall. So there's our welcome back sign. Next slide, please. We're a smaller district, about 4,300 students. The high school is just around just over 1,400 kids. We have seven schools in our district, but we are a district of choice. So as a district of choice, what that means is that about 40%, between 40 and 50% of our students are from out of district. So the local community gives us a large chunk of our students, but kids are coming to here from all over. And so that has led to some complications around COVID issues. Next slide, please. Just as quick background, like the rest of you, when we were doing contact tracing, what we had done is we used color labs for all of our weekly testing of all extracurriculars. So not just athletes, but also our choral students, our band students, and clubs that are meeting extracurricularly. So we've been testing them all weekly for the whole year. And our indoor extracurricular activities are largely masked, but not entirely masked. For example, if a student's playing basketball while they're playing the game, they're not going to be masked while they're playing the game. And we set up a dedicated email address so that students and families could report any positive COVID cases or give us back test results. The contact tracing, which you all know about, we had a team of district team and site personnel who were going through and making, checking seating charts and going through and making individual calls to figure out who was a close contact and who was not, and then having conversations with them directly with maybe who they ate lunch next to or those kind of things. And then determining their vaccination status and going through that whole process of doing this. It was very intensive. And at a secondary school, unlike an elementary school where we've got a bunch of kids sharing one classroom, at a secondary school, we've got one student, if they tested positive, that might generate 35 close contacts. So it was an immense number of conversations that we had to have with people. And those were conversations we had directly with them on the phone. So we were on the phone all the time, talking with people and making sure everybody knew what to do next. Next slide, please. As was stated previously, in January, there was just no capacity for us to continue that process, right? We were overloaded immediately. Our return to campus was roughly the same as Ms. Pacaoan's. We also distributed antigen tests and had everybody go out and take these tests, and we got a lot of positives. And so we were telling people, to stay home and make sure that they weren't coming on campus after they had tested positive. So we had a huge number of absences. In the first week back, we were up around 20% of our students were absent. We're down around 5% now, right? So what we've done with the group tracing, is now when we have a positive students on campus, we send out emails to the classroom or the sports team, and we give them instructions on what they're supposed to do next. And we lay it all out for them and explain to them that testing after roughly day 5 is where they want to go, and that they need to make sure that they're continuing to wear their masks. And for the most important thing is to make sure, and the word that was used previously was to monitor, but we just want to make sure that anybody who's symptomatic is not coming on campus, and that if they are symptomatic, they are making sure that testing and taking care of themselves and their families. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we did set up was in combination between our site at the high school here and our district office, we had district and site personnel going through and double checking who is off campus because of COVID, whether it was because of an exposure and they didn't want to test, or they were positive. And we want to make sure that we know that nobody's coming back on campus ahead of time. And the great thing is that our students and our families have been wonderful about reporting where they are and what they're doing. And we're going through and we color code this. We check this every morning against who could come on campus. You can see in the red there, what was their last day on campus? And then you look, further to the right, when can they come back to school? And if they can come back to school, under what circumstances? And did we get clearance? And so they're all color coded in there so that we can very quickly then check our attendance and make sure that nobody's come on campus before they were supposed to do that. Right. Thank you. Next slide. So the greatest benefit is we just couldn't keep up. So the group emails is a lot faster than making individual phone calls. As I described it, in a secondary campus, when one student takes 6 different classes, they could be next to 30 or more people. So one positive case was overwhelming us last semester, and the group contact, the group tracing has been a lot better. For us to be able to send these emails and just communicate better what is the right approach for the student and the family to take. Next slide, please. The biggest challenge is, as was described, setting this up, we didn't have a lot of time. We were we're coming back off a winter break, and the Omicron surge is happening all at the same time. So we're all working over our winter break, trying to figure out exactly what it is that we can do to mitigate any efforts. And we were very excited to be able to give out all of the rapid antigen tests and have everybody testing before they came onto campus. So we were able to keep kids who tested positive with those rapid antigen tests, keep them off campus in that first week coming back. That was a really, really, really big deal. But it took a lot of work to set that up. We had teachers and district administrators and site administrators and family members out there handing out these rapid antigen tests and a long line of cars for hours, making sure that we could make that happen. Another difficult part of this is that we've had to understand that this is a communication situation where having parents who are obviously concerned about their children, having them understand exactly what it is that we're saying to them with the guidelines that we're giving them has been a little bit difficult, right? And I think another piece that I didn't list on here is that we have had, especially at the beginning, parents might get email overload, right? They've been getting emails for 2 years about all this. And so getting past the flood of emails that they're getting and making sure that they really understand what does it mean that there was a student in the same class with their child who has tested positive, and what does that mean? What should they do next? That's required a lot of phone calls on our part. So, but really our families and our staffs have been amazing and flexible and really conscientious about making sure that we are keeping everybody safe. And like I said, our absence rate has dropped precipitously, and so we're very excited about what's going to happen going forward. And thank you very much. That's my time.
Perfect timing, as always, Matt. Thank you so much for everything and all of your words. I now will turn it over to Ms. Hannah Mestel. Hannah?
Thanks very much, Dr. Dorian. All right, so as they say, misery loves company. And it's a little bit of I shouldn't say relief, but there is a little bit of that. We've had 1,900 cases in our schools since the beginning of January compared to just under 300 in the first chunk of the school year. So that was definitely a wild ride through January. And as Dr. Dorian said, we never want to live through another COVID January here in that particular way. But a huge shout out to all of our campus administrators who've really made it possible for us to keep everyone in school while we've rode through this wild ride. So just a little bit of background. Pleasanton Unified is a city in the suburbs of the San Francisco Bay Area. We're 45 minutes southeast of San Francisco or 35 minutes northeast of San Jose. Next slide, please. And we have just over 14,000 students on 16 sites. Interestingly, we have a very strong occupational education program, which is going to come into play when we talk about our testing center operations. We have a very strong testing operation that we run out of the district rather than using an outside vendor. We're open for over 30 hours a week, and we offer rapid antigen testing for our Pleasanton Unified students, staff, and families. We average anywhere from 75 to 500 tests a week, as you can see in the chart in the bottom right here. The first couple weeks back from school were really intense in terms of the amount of testing we were doing, with several hundred tests every day. And the big spike in the middle was Martin Luther King Jr. Day, where we had a line that literally the snake touched its tail, like it met all the way around the block. But as you can see, the last couple of weeks, we've established kind of a more regular pattern, and we're following into a new normal, which is really exciting to see. Next slide, please. So to run our testing center operations, we have a pretty big staff of trained by next now at proctors, essentially. And it's a little different in that we don't, it's not our school district nurses. We get a lot of support from them on other protocols, but our testing is run out of our pandemic services team. We have 18 contact tracing and testing employees who serve all of our campuses and also work on our testing sites. 21 student interns who are biomedical or medical occupation high schoolers. And then we have 115 high school nursing focused students who are doing supervised clinical shifts with us. Usually these students are in a hospital doing their clinical supervision hours during their second semester, but they are not able to get those clinical hours right now because understandably those hospitals don't want students coming in and potentially having the risk of being exposed or the risk of exposing others themselves. And so we've really had this opportunity to bring in those students and give them this hands-on career opportunity, as well as really leveraging them to make our testing operations more efficient. Next slide, please. Because of the huge surge in testing demand, we have prioritized symptomatic people for testing most of all, followed by those who are involved in household exposures, regardless of vaccination status, those unvaccinated school exposures who have no symptoms, prior positives who want to retest to shorten isolation. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, vaccinated school exposures without symptoms. To match up to what Ms. Pacaoan said about the fall, we tested over 5,100 students in the fall for modified quarantine with a similar positivity rate, far less than 1%. And then we also ran about 8,500 tests for surveillance, PCR tests for surveillance. That matches up to what you can imagine is a completely unsustainable rate, which is why we had to develop this testing priorities list. Next slide, please. All right, so moving into our group tracing practices, we differentiate at our elementary campuses versus our middle school and high school campuses. For elementary schools, this is where we're doing the group exposure notification that is more familiar from what Mr. McClenahan and Ms. Pacaoan just described. So students and staff who are in that shared airspace for more than 15 minutes receive a group exposure notification via email. And those students can continue to attend as long as they don't have symptoms. We do recommend testing on day 5, regardless of vaccination status. And outside of the classroom, we also notify that whole campus that there was a positive case or cases on campus. Next slide, please. That differs a little bit for certain groups at other levels besides elementary. So STC classes, we are always notifying of group exposures, regardless of whether it's in high school, middle school, or elementary. Bus transportation, we notify the entire group. And then all of our indoor sports teams. Same with special programs and clubs that meet indoors. We treat those as group exposures. Again, testing is recommended, with one exception. We still do pull out our unmasked exposures from indoor and outdoor unmasked close contacts and require that they test on day 5 after exposure. This is because we have a pretty detailed data tracking system for our exposures, and we were able to go back and look at the likelihood of someone testing positive after exposure in an unmasked exposure versus a masked exposure. And the numbers bore that out for us to separate that and continue to follow through. At the same time, it was really nice to be able to allow those students to be on campus during that time instead of staying home for those 5 days as previously specified. All right, next slide. So at the secondary level, we are notifying all families in the entire campus of the number of positive cases at their middle or high school on a daily basis. So every night, you get an email that says, at this high school, there were 7 cases reported yesterday. As a result, we are asking every student and staff member at our middle school and high school campuses to consider them exposed to COVID-19 right now, even if they don't receive a specific exposure notification. We were sending out literally hundreds of emails every day, and it wasn't a sustainable situation either operationally or for our families trying to take in that information and make sense of what to do. So next slide, please. As we've heard from my fellow panelists, group tracing has been really helpful for being able to get notification out there faster and also able to for us to manage the protocol for modified quarantine and balance it with the needs of group tracing. It's a much more efficient use of our resources. What we haven't heard much about today that I really want to highlight is that it has also allowed our teachers to have much more natural interactions in their classrooms because they are relying less on really strict seating charts, and they're letting the kids move around the classroom as they would have in years past. And then we heard from Dr. Sood a few times in recent weeks that it really reflects the it better reflects the nature of viral transmission in this airborne aerosolized world, because the 6-foot rule may or may not be super relevant when you have a bunch of air shifting through the classroom. So that was why it was really welcome for us to adopt this group tracing model. Next slide, please. All right. At the secondary level, however, as we've heard from everyone on this panel, it has been truly prohibitive. The high number of cases combined with 6 to 8 classes a day for a positive case at the secondary level meant we had hundreds of notifications every day. A family might receive multiple emails in a single day, and they wouldn't necessarily know which student they applied to because it was too much volume for administrators to tag each email with each student's name. And so parents simply stopped paying attention. So we decided to capture their attention in a way that was actually meaningful to them so that we could get the actions taken that we wanted them to take, which was, in the words of my esteemed colleagues up here, monitor for symptoms, pay attention, and be aware. Next slide, please. Our big lessons learned were to really be mindful of parent burnout with communications in general. We have heard from some families that they miss the individual notifications of exposure, but we have heard more that they're glad to have more of a weather report. You know, there were 7 cases on this campus, or there were 0 cases on this campus. And again, I just want to shout out our campus COVID-19 liaisons because they have so many insights from the parent feedback that they get. They're doing far too many jobs on campus, and they need to get all the air cover they can. So this group contact tracing approach really helped give them some relief. And then, as I mentioned before, we really let data help make our decisions. Our tracking really let us know which scenarios were converting from an exposure to a case, and it gave us a lot of confidence in being able to back off of some of the specific exclusions from school that we were doing before. All right, so next slide, I think that's the end. We do a number of other testing programs, and our athlete surveillance and wind musician surveillance has been very effective. I think this is going to change a little bit, though, as we move into the spring, only because we've had so many kids who've tested positive that we're now going to need to exclude them from PCR testing for a long time. And then if we're waiting for a long time for a PCR result to come back, we actually don't take that positive student and immediately remove them from campus, because half the time or more now we're finding that it's an old viral signature and not necessarily an active infection. So we do retest PCRs with rapid antigens now, which is quite the turn of events from where we might have been in the fall, where we were retesting rapid antigens with a PCR. Next, I think that is the end. All right, thanks, and back to Dr. Dorian.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for all of your information. And I really am amazed at, sort of that interesting, unique workforce capacity that you have in your school to be able to help with the testing. That's amazing. All right, I want to thank all of our panelists for their insight, their candidness, their authenticity. Can I ask you all to please turn on your cameras and join me for a bit of Q&A? I would like to take this opportunity to pose the first question. So we've received this question from the audience. We've heard it come up quite a few times in our conversations and our meetings. The question really is around what happens, or how do you address that issue around students who decide not to test, and sort of what does that actually mean in reference to their participation in your schools around sports and extracurricular activities. And for the panelists that are, going to address this, can you also just think a little bit about advice to sort of give all of us here on how you've been dealing with students that are refusing to test as you're utilizing this group tracing approach? Can I open it up to you, Matt, first, since you're leading a high school, and then Hannah, can you also jump in and tell us what you're doing in your district?
Sure. So we have been surveillance testing all of our athletes this whole time. So if somebody is doing any extracurriculars, they're testing right along. So it's really kind of a non-issue here, because if they're not testing, then they're not playing. So that's how we've sort of handled that. If we have a student just who's not doing extracurriculars, who's in class, what we're really looking for is, are they showing symptoms? That's what we're really looking for. So we advise them to test, but we're looking to make sure that nobody's coming onto campus if they're symptomatic.
Yeah, and I can echo a lot of what Matt said. And we're testing, our surveillance programs happen weekly for every athlete who plays an indoor sport, as well as every wind instrument musician. We don't currently test extracurriculars beyond those two sets. But we did do over 8,500 surveillance tests last semester and had a very low positivity rate, but we were able to act on those positive cases as they were identified. Similar to what Mr. McClenahan said, if you don't test, you don't play. We do give people a grace period. So if they miss a test 1 week, they can test the following week and remain in practice or in rehearsal, but they need to be testing consistently. And our local health jurisdiction has really been supportive of that. That's really in line with what they want to see, especially for those high-risk activities. And it's been a good trade-off, because it's enabled the players and coaches and musicians to all feel much safer and really cut down on the amount of transmission that we've had undetected in those groups.
Thank you so much. So I always hear that, right? Consistency and monitoring seems to be something that everybody is echoing as we're moving forward. Hannah, I'm going to turn to you. I believe you have a question for Dr. Sudd.
I do. One of the questions that we keep hearing is this group trusting model, is it group tracing? Is it required or recommended, Dr. Sudd?
Yeah, great question, Hannah. Since the start of the school year, all of the state's guidance around isolation and quarantine for K-12 students have been recommendations. That includes the prior guidance around contact tracing and this new group contact tracing model. And part of that is that we understand that there needs to be some flexibility and nuance. And frankly, there needs to be some understanding of the resources necessary to implement such practices. So it's a recommendation. And again, there can be some local variation in terms of how it's implemented. And I think we all learn from that. For example, you just shared some really great ideas around testing prioritization that make perfect sense, along with blanket exposure notifications, right? So creating kind of riffing on what we lay down as a structure, a skeleton of guidance is absolutely what we encourage folks to do to figure out how it can work for their resources and their communities.
Great, thank you so much. We're running out of time and I have so many questions. So I'm gonna ask Anna-Liza a question if we're okay with that. Anna-Liza, we had a question about special ed students who are really struggling with sort of this weekly testing. Many of the students can't verbalize, they're not sharing why they don't want to be, swabbed or saliva tested. Just kind of thinking about your school and sort of the school nurses, what are some options and appropriate accommodations that you've been able to make in really looking again at this group testing?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think our special ed kids are a group in which there's a lot of concern because compliance with masking is an issue. They often have high needs and including medical needs. And so, but at the same time, there's no real interest in closing classrooms. We really try to maintain flexibility. We're closely monitoring the students. And we ensure that the other mitigation measures are in place. So distance as much as possible, promote optimal ventilation, increase PPE in the classroom. And then we have conversations with the parents to gauge their own personal risk and give them the option to quarantine at home as best practice.
Great, thank you so much. By the way, all of the Q&A, we're gonna be putting out hopefully an FAQ once we get through both of these webinars so that all of those questions will be answered as quickly as we can for all of you. But I'm gonna do just a rapid round because we don't have time and I really wanna just zoom out a bit. So for all of the panelists actually, just really quickly, maybe one word if we can, what's your biggest hope, stars and wishes for the remainder of the year, and maybe your biggest challenge or concern? Matt, can I start with you?
Biggest hope is that everyone stays safe and my teachers get a little peace. My teachers need some peace, and my biggest concern is students' mental health.
Hannah?
Yeah, I think my biggest hope is that we return to normal, keep being mindful of what we've learned. And then my one thing for school nurses is I will never complain about a lice outbreak ever again.
Thank you so much, Anna-Liza. Hannah?
I never thought norovirus looked good until now. My hope is definitely that the kids continue to find ways to get really authentic school experiences and continue learning. And my fear is just that we continue to build together a great path forward. So as we have changes that maybe throw us some curveballs that we haven't expected yet, that we continue to move forward as a community so that we know that we're continue to be in this all together and as much as we can just collaborate and find the best way forward. We're all here to do the same thing and get these, we're gonna reach the future together.
Absolutely. Dr. Sud, I'm gonna ask you too.
I would agree with everything everyone else has said. I mean, broadly speaking, I really hope we can take this pot of COVID and move it to the back burner and really focus schools on what we're all there, as parents, as teachers, as students to really, be there to learn and grow and develop and thrive and have fun. So that's my hope, is that we always think about prevention and mitigation, but not at the forefront of everything that we're doing.
Thank you so much. Again, teamwork, right? For me too, I'm thinking teamwork, communication, consistency, monitoring, everything we talked about, and ultimately also just caring for one another. I love what Dr. McClenahan said. Our teachers, our school administrators, they're heroes at the forefront of everything that's happening. And we're so very grateful. I always say my thank yous run short. It almost doesn't feel like it's enough to say thank you. So once again, a big thank you to all our esteemed panelists for their wisdom, their insight. Thank you all participants for being here, sharing your valuable time with us. Remember to come back and join us next week, Thursday, February 17th, 4 to 5. We'll talk a little bit more about guidance, more about group-based contact tracing and testing. All of our prior principal practices webinars are on the Safe Schools for All website, schools.covid19.ca.gov. It was also in the chat that we put it in. Again, thank you all for being here. Good luck with all of your programming, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a wonderful evening.